Hey, and welcome back to Baking Broke. Banana bread is one of my favorite answers to what to do with the bananas that have gotten too brown to the point that you don't want to eat them anymore. I've tried so many different recipes for banana bread, and some of them require a lot of extra steps and ingredients. Some of them are pretty simple overall, but I always run into this issue where the centers can be undercooked. It's gooey and it's just not right for real bread. So I'll put it on aluminum foil, do a lot of other unnecessary stuff. But I've found a recipe that I want to share with you that's very in line with the ideas of baking broke. We've got very few ingredients and it's a really easy time. So without further ado, it's banana bread time! Banana bread time! Where you at? Where you at? That was... No, actually I was going to say... No, I was going to say that's a little bit strange up until the point that I just saw you, Mr. Monkey Face, and when it comes to strange, you definitely take the cake. Alright, enough monkeying around. No. Back to the recipe. Now, like I'd said, this is a wonderful recipe for baking broke. We've got 3 dry ingredients that you're going to need. A cup and a half of the flour. I like all-purpose. We've got a half a teaspoon of salt, and that can be sea salt, kosher salt, table salt, whatever you happen to have on hand. And 1 teaspoon of baking soda. And while it didn't matter what type of salt you were using, do make sure that when it comes to baking soda and baking powder, you're using the right one. They are not the same. They don't work the same. So for this recipe, make sure you've got the baking soda. On the side of the wet ingredients, we're going to start off with bananas, obviously, because this is banana bread. The browner, the better. These actually have more yellow than I would normally like, but they'll work for this one. For sugar, we'll need 3/4 of a cup. We'll need 1 egg, and a half a cup of mayonnaise. Wait a minute, seriously, mayonnaise? No. Mr. Monkey Face, I thought we said we weren't monkeying around anymore. Alright, let me check the ingredients again. Yeah, okay, half a cup of mayonnaise. And yes, I am kidding. I have done this recipe, and the mayonnaise really works in it. So that's the short and simple list of what you're going to need. Starting off with the dry ingredients, we'll take the flour to begin with. And that's going to be a total of 1.5 cups. For this, I'm using a half cup measuring scoop. I've got the 1 cup in, and there's 2, and I'm not quite there for the final half cup. Now, either I could wind up shortening the rest of the recipe and trying to draw back on that, and it's going to turn out maybe alright, but thankfully I had a second bag of flour on hand. Flour and sugar being 2 of the staples that you should have in your pantry pretty much at all times. And thankfully, having that one last bag, I was able to top off the third half scoop, making 1.5 cups. Crisis averted. To that 1.5 cups of flour, we'll add the half teaspoon of salt. Once again, remembering that any type of salt will do, but for the teaspoon, make sure it's the smaller one. Teaspoon, not a tablespoon on this one. You could wind up measuring it right above the flour, but if anything spills out, you're going to screw up your flour. So you might as well portion out that half teaspoon of salt over top of something else, and that way if it spills, no harm, no foul. Now, I did the salt first because salt normally won't stick to your measuring device, and if it does, it's really easy to clean out. Now that we're done with the salt, we can take that half teaspoon and use it for our baking soda, meaning that with it being a half teaspoon, we're going to need 2 of those to equal the 1 teaspoon required for the recipe. We'll whisk those all together, or if you don't have a whisk, of course, use your hand. But whisks work wonderfully well for dry goods. Now that we're done with the dry goods, we can preheat the oven because we're coming down to the end of the recipe. For the oven temperature, we're going to go with 350 degrees. Starting off with a small bowl, we'll break the egg and have that separate. That way, if you do happen to have any broken pieces of shell that get mixed in there, it's a lot easier to clean out than it would be if we mixed it together with everything else. Go ahead and put your egg aside, and we'll move on to the bananas. With really brown bananas, they won't even hold up to being handled too often. You'll pick up the peel and it'll just start falling out. Those are wonderful for banana bread, but that's pretty much it. As I mentioned earlier, these are a little bit more yellow than I would normally like, but they are going to work. The only big difference is, when it comes time to mash the bananas, taking a fork or spoon or whatever we might have, we are going to have to take a little bit more time mashing them up, whereas a full-on brown or black banana will come almost pre-mushed. It'll require very little mashing with our utensil. Don't overdo it. We do not want a uniform consistency. We want big chunks, small chunks, lumpiness. We want different forms and consistencies on this one. Adding to our bananas, we take 3/4 cup of sugar, and I'm using a 1/4 cup, so that's going to be 1 of them, 2 of them, and there's 3, so that's 3/4 cup of sugar we're adding to the 3 bananas. And we'll take our egg in that separate bowl. We'll mix it up just a bit. Remember, we do not want uniformity in this. We want it to have its own personality, every little bit and chunk and piece. And that looks pretty good. It's lumpy like a space princess, and that's what we're looking for in this recipe. So I think that about does the wet ingredients for this one. Except for the mayonnaise. I know I didn't want to add it either. It sounded weird and gross, and I'm not a fan of mayonnaise to begin with, but that's what the recipe calls for, so we'll give it a shot. We'll add that 1/2 cup of mayonnaise to our mixture. And once again, don't overmix it. I think I may have overmixed this one just a bit back when we were adding the sugar to the mashed up bananas. The main reason we don't want to overmix is it's going to make for a very dense loaf. We want ours to be fairly light and airy if we can get it that way. So mixing in the mayonnaise, we're going to make darn sure we don't overdo it this time. We'll add the dry ingredients into the wet, about 1/3 of the mixture at a time, making sure that we keep that lumpy vibe going on. You'll even see dry patches of flour. That's perfectly alright. Leave those be. And that looks pretty good. We'll put our mixture aside for the moment and bring over our bread pan. And yes, a bread pan is kind of mandatory if you're going to be baking something like banana bread. Something relatively dark and non-stick usually works best. To make sure our bread doesn't stick to the pan after it's baked, we're going to need something like shortening or lard or butter to coat the inside, or a cooking spray if you like, would work fine, or you could use parchment paper. Personally, I like using butter or lard. There's just something about the texture of it, and it just works well for me. It's my personal preference on that. And if you like using your hands, this might be a good one for you too. Otherwise, you can totally use parchment paper. It'll make cleanup a lot easier, and if you're topping your banana bread off with anything that might get messy, using the parchment paper will allow you to lift the entire loaf out at the end of the baking process. The reason I'm not a big fan of parchment paper when it comes to bread pans is that I can never get it to fit in there quite nicely enough for my taste. But if parchment paper works easier for you, by all means, use it. It's your recipe, it's your time in the kitchen. It's your thing, do what you want to do. Sorry about that. Now that we have our pan prepared, we're going to take our banana bread mixture and either scoop or use a spatula, which is probably the better method, and get all of it out as best you can. Oh boy, look at that lumpy batter. But since I was using the parchment paper for this one anyways, I figure I'd try out something new and top it off with some mini chocolate chips. Usually, when the loaf is done baking, if we're not using parchment paper, we'll take the pan, flip it over, and gravity will do the rest to get the loaf out of the pan. Now, this pushes down on the top of the bread, so we're limited if we're going to do anything like I'm doing with the chocolate chips. If I try and flip over bread with hot chocolate chips on the top, I'm going to have a pretty big mess. With the parchment paper, when the bread is done baking, I can simply lift our loaf right out of the pan without having to worry about damaging our chocolate chips. You could also put chocolate chips right into the batter if you wanted. Or another addition I believe that they mentioned in the original recipe would be walnuts. I think it was about a half cup or 3/4 cup that they actually used for the original recipe. With my ulcerative colitis, I sort of avoid nuts most of the time. You can do what you want. If it's going to work for you, by all means, put nuts in your bread. Here's one I did without the parchment paper and without the chocolate chips on top. It's just a standard grease pan. Whichever way you choose to do it, we're going to take our pan and put it into that preheated 350-degree oven for 1 hour. And of course, baking times can vary, but I have found that 1 hour is the perfect amount of time for this recipe. At least for me. When the hour is up, we're going to carefully pull out the rack on which your banana bread is baking, and take either a toothpick or a butter knife and check the middle of the bread. Providing it comes out clean, that means your banana bread is all set. Let the pan set for about 5 to 10 minutes until cool enough to handle, at which point you're going to take it over and transfer it onto a cooling rack to finish cooling the rest of the way. From the cooling rack, you can move on either to a standard serving plate, or you can put it into a freezer bag for later use. Once your bread's done cooling, slice yourself off a piece and enjoy. And with the mayonnaise, I really wasn't sure I was going to like this, but, and I'm very sorry to say it, the bread is moist. I know, I'm sorry, a lot of you don't like that word, but there's no other way to describe this one. Trust me, it rocks. Put the mayonnaise in there, you're gonna dig this. A great thing that you can do with leftover bananas when you don't have enough for the banana bread is to make frozen banana chips. Take a baking pan with a sheet of parchment paper over top, and removing most of the peel from your banana, leaving one segment, take a knife and start slicing your banana into maybe about a 1/4 inch round chips, a little bit thinner than the thickness of your finger, and go through, do that with the entire banana, keeping them fairly uniform in size. Once you've sliced the banana completely, take the chips and lay them out on the parchment paper. And this one piece looks a little bit too brown for my taste. It had come in contact with the air for a few days. I don't want to use it, so I am going to toss it. Use your own discretion when it comes to whether or not something's edible. Take your tray and put it into the freezer for probably around 3 hours. You can check on them whenever you like. Now, once they're finally frozen, you've got a few different options. You can eat them straight out of the freezer, which is what I tend to do, or you can melt down some chocolate and coat each one in chocolate. Or you could take them frozen, put them on top of your favorite frozen peanut butter cup, and just eat them together. That way you got the peanut butter banana and chocolate. Plenty of stuff you can do. Let your mind run wild on this one. Well, I think that just about does it for this episode. We've learned some stuff to do with overly ripe bananas, and you've got a question? I don't know why people like bananas. Alright, that's enough for this episode. Thanks for joining in on the fun. Thanks for watching. I hope you try out the banana bread, and let me know how it goes. Until next time.
Banana bread time, banana bread time, banana bread time with a baseball bat. Banana bread time, banana bread time, banana bread time with a baseball bat.